Good morning, everyone. In U.S. History 2, we're on Chapter 18, Life in Industrial America. It's a chapter I think that's very well written. I don't know how much you need to hear from me, but I guess part of developing a relationship in a class is getting a sense of who I am and what I think are some of the high points in the chapter. And these are not rehearsed and they're not scripted. And so if there's faux pas along the way, or if I miss certain sections that you think are important, certainly don't be afraid to reach out. And that's how we'll keep a dialogue going throughout the course of the semester. But I love the introduction, the way it starts with a Roger Kipling observation in Chicago. When was he here? 1889, really, at the, if not the height, certainly in the midst of it, the Industrial Revolution. And he visits, I think it's Chicago. Yeah, he's visiting Chicago. And he talks about the mass of humanity walking up and down the streets and all the bustling factories and businesses and building boom and all of the cacophony of activity that's going on in the city overwhelms him. And I didn't underline his quotes. I wish I had, but he basically described it as a rushed and crowded city, a huge wilderness. It's a bit of a pun. Scores of miles of terrible streets and hundreds of thousands of these terrible people. Roger Kipling happens to be one of my favorite authors, and some of his poetry is just, I think, fantastic. One of his motivational poems called If you ever just Google it and listen to it on YouTube, is very I don't know, puts the hair on my neck up on end. So when I hear Roger Kipling describing it as such a this horrific cacophony of industrialism, I think it's probably fairly accurate to what was going on in the American cities. And the cities were growing rapidly. In fact, this is the transition point. We remove ourselves from an agrarian nation in terms of most populations, most people identifying themselves living in an agrarian community to living in an industrial city. It changes dramatically and changes the identity of America. And we know we have greater output as we start the Industrial Revolution till when we get into the height of it. We were just trying to compete with countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain. And not only do we surpass them, but we surpass them all combined because of technology and because of the mass manufacturing processes and the development of the trains throughout the nation, connecting basically from East Coast to West Coast and all of the industries in between that really changed America. Most people think for the better. We became this manufacturing giant, but some people are left behind. Like in any great boom, there are those that suffer as a result. And some people say it was labor and the working class and those that toiled without education and any real skills other than a strong back and an ability to hustle for low wages. Arguably, America was built on those people. Some can go back even further and say, well, the initial springboard of this was the textile industries, which was supported by the cotton industry, which is supported by slavery. If you want to get into really depth analysis of the different peoples that didn't always reap all the benefits from the great economic and material boon that was the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, Roger Kipling, just as another side, I was just reminiscing about my dad this morning, and there's a famous movie called Gunga Din that when I was a kid, it was really important to me. And in Gunga Din, at the funeral scene, there's a poem that's Roger Kipling's poem about Gunga Din. Way off track, but sometimes that's what I would do if I were in a real class. I'm trying to make this as realistic as it would be if I was there discussing this stuff with you. But we talk about the massive city growth. In fact, there's a nice, I'm not a big fan of statistics, but sometimes statistics can bring it to life what's happening here. Chicago's population, 1870. At that time, a quarter of the nation's populations lived in cities, just a quarter. By 1920, a majority did. It's really amazing. That's, it's a 50-year time span, but we shifted that from just 20% or 25% to over 50% live in cities. And the Chicago is a perfect example of the great gigantic influx of people, mostly immigrants. Many of them initially were from Germany and Scandinavia and Ireland. Now there's a shift to this later part, and also nativist resentment to the immigration starts to shift as less English-speaking people come over in greater numbers, like Poles, Italians, Czechs, Hungarians, and Lithuanians, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants made up a new majority of immigrants in this area. What's interesting, though, is in 1900, nearly 80% of Chicago's population was either foreign-born or the children, second generation Americans. Really remarkable country when you call it a country of immigrants. Chicago was certainly representative of the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Industrialization and technical innovation. What's the heart of it? Its starting point, it's the railroads. The railroads created the first great centralization of capital, of industry, of changing the way in which businesses run, in the sense that there was a new tier of ownership class, and then a managerial class, of professional accountants and managers, and then laboring sections of the business. It was really amazing. And railroads were the first large business in our country's history. And we know this is the development from the last chapter of the robber barons, the steel industry, although the oil industry takes off as well too. A lot of people think it was because of oil for combustion engines, but combustion engines don't really come till later on. But it was really kerosene, but oil was important for other industries in that time too. But there's the electric becomes through Edison becomes critical during this period of time. But there's the steel, there's the rails. With Carnegie, and then banking and oil, they all become huge during this period of time, and the dreaded monopoly and the abuses of the monopoly come in. But there's an argument there, and no one ever seems to want to take the side of the, including me, right? I don't want to take the side of the oligarchic wealthy people, but they do deserve some credit for bringing America forward in terms of rapid development and technological changes. And monopolization allowed them to have that unfettered control over business and industries that they dominated, to their benefit and to the detriment of many of the working people that worked under their leadership, but also to the society's advancement as well. So I don't like looking at history just one-sided, because it's multifaceted, and they are not only responsible for great abuses, they're also responsible for great advancements in our society. And later, most of them became, and it's in this chapter, it's a double-edged sword, they become philanthropists with their money. They start donating it to charitable causes, and the question is it dirty money? We'll get to that when I get near the end of the chapter. Just trying to get through some of the things that I thought were really critical during this period of time. Industrialization really changes everything. And we know Edison, you should know where he had his business in Menlo Park, which was really interesting. He actually created sort of a factory of invention, and he planned on creating, and he was not only a business manager, but he was an inventor. And he had this interesting thing. What was this quote that he was going to make? But skilled machinists, scientists, all the work in there, commercializing the whole aspect of basically industrial and technological advancements. But he had a quote like he was going to have one good invention every week and a major one every 2 years or something like that. And that was his goal. He did have many, obviously, and he's responsible for basically illuminating the large cities first on by creating these convincing municipal governments to put power stations throughout the location of the city, really changing us from the dangerous gas lighting systems to electric. Electric wasn't always so safe in the beginning either, but nonetheless, it wasn't just illuminating at night. It was creating manufacturing abilities through the power of electricity that was well superior to steam power or river power. It really changed the game in terms of productivity and speed. Immigration, we know the huge immigration didn't always go rural. Some did. Some that had money and success would go rural. Most went to the cities. And in resentment, immigration has always been a funny, weird sort of concept. When immigration was needed, oftentimes American companies and even the American government will participate in recruiting new immigration to come to our nation to help build it. But then at times when there was enough people and there was competition for labor and needs its citizenry, oftentimes immigrants got seen as a threat. And that still goes on to this day. We have this mixed feeling about being a nation of immigrants to also being sometimes suspicious and resentful of people that don't speak the same language, don't look the same way as we do. And what's interesting about that is I think when this stuff goes on, if you study history, it's important to recognize that some of that bigotry and ignorance and hatred is founded on economic bias, but it's also founded on irrationality, and it was just as harmful as it was then it is today. And I'm not talking about illegal. I'm talking about legal immigration. Legally, immigrated people were often resented in their communities initially. And that's one of the big myths we always, at least I was always taught when I was a kid, we're a big melting pot. We all come to this country and we kind of all become Americanized, and we all kind of adopt Americanism as our, and you know, I had my father, I think I referenced earlier, he and I were very, very close. So when I was a kid, I was just curious, you know, am I Irish, am I German, you know, what am I? And he was a bit of a comedian and a bit of an eccentric. And when I say, "Oh, Dad, I'm Irish," right? He used to say, "Oh, no, you just look ridiculous," or he just would make fun of the moment. He didn't want me to identify ethnically. He wanted me to identify as an American. But the problem is we don't always do that, and many people don't either. And when you come over to a new nation and you feel shunned by some of the people that you meet, you often do what? You go to those who you're familiar with. So the argument that we become a melting pot and we become one as American isn't always true. Many people gravitate to like culturally, religious, ethnically, racially similar people, and that's what creates communities that are often identified with ethnic communities, ethnic neighborhoods. And it's an interesting phenomenon that happen in large cities. There are many large cities that have certain sections of them that are, you know, historically been Polish, and others that have been Lithuanian, and might be smaller. African American communities would develop in certain areas as well for both identification, but also for protection and for feelings of acceptance. It's a strange part of our history that's both beautiful, the assimilation, when it works and it happens, it is beautiful, and when it doesn't and it's filled with distrust and hatred, it really is sad, and gives us a unique challenge, I think, in America, because we are a nation of immigrants. There's no question about it. Now, it says that by 1920, the U.S. Census revealed that the Americans lived more in urban areas than anywhere else. And between 1870 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States. And the new immigrants were much less welcome than previous ones, not just because of competition over labor, but these people were different. They were largely Eastern European, Southern European people, and from the Asian countries as well. And that was because they often practiced different religions. Many of them were Catholics. The Protestant Americans often were suspicious of popeism in the Catholic faith, and that brought a certain degree of tension. And I'm a big John F. Kennedy, I'd like to say scholar. I remember the scholar. I'm just interested in it. It came up during his election. To run as a Catholic was very, very much considered to be maybe taboo, even in 1960, the 1960 election. And we're talking here 1900, late 18, basically the last 25 years of the 1800s into 1900 is this chapter. The suspicion of Catholicism was very significant in many of those that were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, were either Catholics or Jews, and there was a challenge for them to come over. They weren't always welcomed with open arms. Yeah, this is interesting. By 1890, immigrants and their children accounted for roughly 60% of the population in large northern cities, sometimes as high as 80 or 90%. It's really a remarkable thing. And then they bring up that in terms of political ideology, the party that tended to work with recent immigrants and to basically use the power of recent immigrants were the Democratic Party. And they were often, and I'm not condemning the Democratic Party, I've been a Democrat, I am a Democrat right now, I've been a Republican, I'm not a Republican right now, I'm a Democrat, but the Democratic Party historically has been a big tent party in the sense that immigrants have often been accepted into that party a little bit more readily, and they were also very corrupt in this era. Tammany Hall and these other political machines in these large cities are often condemned for all the graft and the bribery and the wrongdoing and basically political patronage that would only go through their political machines. But they also have to be complimented in the sense that they did provide a certain social safety net for many of the recent immigrants, and they did. That's true of Boston as it is true of Chicago. Tammany Hall and these other groups and these other bosses, these precinct bosses, not only they'd be responsible for making sure you as a recent immigrant would support their candidate, and they would get their pet projects through and basically rip off the government for a significant amount of the money, but the projects got done, often benefiting some of these new inner city immigrants, but they'd also provide housing and show people where to live and how to function within the community and help them get jobs, although they are based upon political patronage, but nonetheless, it still served a social function. I know it sounds a bit odd that I'm trying to say that political corruption has a good side, but there is some history to these political machines being a social safety net for some of these recent immigrant families that came over. And this is at the time agrarian communities really languished. There was commodity prices for the farm basically product was going way down, and the communities languished educationally and in terms of economic success. There's no question. So while cities boomed, rural worlds languished, and that's there's no question between that. And the tension actually grows politically, and we know from the previous chapter the populist movement is related to the agrarian political movement, and they are anti-city, and they see basically these people making money from money and not making money from the product of working on the farms. And a real tension develops between who seems to be getting all the windfall and where is government responsiveness most acutely needed. There's a tension between the agrarian world and the world of the city. And that's why William Jennings Bryan captured most of the agrarian vote, but it wasn't enough to capture the large populations of the cities. In the New South, and the New South I thought the book did a great job on this. The South just won't let go of a romantic vision of what they represented. They somehow seem to subvert that it was about racism, a big part, the Confederacy, and about slavery, and they create a phenomenon, and it's remarkable how they tried to rewrite history to suggest that it was mostly about state rights, which it was part, but they seem to gloss over the fact that they had a massive race problem, and they continue. This was very true here after what we call the period of Reconstruction, and the federal government's out of the South. The South is largely left to its own internal, governance. And they create all kinds of incredible laws and actions that disenfranchise African Americans in the South. Not everyone, of course, but in terms of just in a broad sweeping fashion, the South just can't let go of its racist history during the turn of the century. It was very, very difficult for African Americans to participate in civic life and business life and in any other form. And there were regular lynchings. In fact, it's ironic. I get news feeds and things come up, and it was this about Ida Wells, and I think she's on the test. Ida Wells wrote a book about lynchings down south, and what's interesting about her is her granddaughter just recently spoke, her great-granddaughter recently spoke, and Ida Wells was talking about how nearly 5,000 white mobs murdered roughly 5,000 African Americans between 1880s and 1950s in these extra legal type situations where, it's Ida Wells is the author, an African American woman author, who discussed how, although slavery ended, there's a new terror basically that exists in the South for many African Americans to participate in daily life. And although there's a new South where there were people pushing to make the South more industrial, to make it more urbane and developed, it just never seemed to catch up during this era of time. It remained very agrarian. It remained very poor, and not everybody. I'm not trying to, and that's a terrible thing when you generalize. I think it's very dangerous. But there was, at least in terms of many of the people in power, remained very, very racist and very, very much inclined to keep African Americans from participating in successful advancement of business or in life. And we know those laws are called Jim Crow laws. You should know that term. Basically segregating schools, transportation, employment. And then they would do things at the election booth. And this is where the term grandfathering comes in, where they would say you'd have to pass a literacy test, sometimes a civics test that was quite hard. However, if you were white, you could be grandfathered if your grandfather had been eligible to vote. That's where the term comes from. Oh, your grandfather was eligible to vote? Well, then you don't have to pass a literacy test or the civics test. The irony of that, if an African American went to vote and says, well, did your grandfather vote? And goes, well, my grandfather was a slave. He wasn't allowed to vote. And I haven't been allowed to go and get a decent education, so I'm also illiterate, so I can't pass the test. So it really, on its face, sounded like an objective test. You just have to be smart enough to read, and we want smart people to participate in civic life, but it was really designed to disenfranchise African Americans. I hate the section book because it depresses me a little bit because I don't think it's necessarily lost anymore. And during this period of time, and it really right up until the 1950s, 1960s, the South and the Southern political powers glossed over and romanticized what the Civil War was really about and what their history was really about. And it talked about basically men of great honor and women of great dignity and of great class. And it was a war of the Northern aggression. And they, this is during a period of time where all these monuments to people like Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders and Confederate military leaders were put up all over the South and to be celebrated. Almost as it was a victory lost, that was still a worthy fight. I find it very troubling myself. And the book does go on and on. The rise of the Negro South, okay, politics, de facto, black voting, suppressed black voters since Reconstruction. You remember that pocket of Reconstruction period of time when the federal government was active in the South with military force, basically protecting African Americans to participate in civil life and vote and things. Many of them got elected to Congress, the United States Senate, to local boards, and they were, for a brief period of time, looked as if the promise of America would be more egalitarian. We know once the Reconstruction stopped with the Compromise of 1877, it all backfired, and the South went back into deeply segregated communities. The good news is, and there is good news, and that's why I like studying history, is today, because of the constitutional amendments and because of things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other laws and actions and court procedures, we've become much more egalitarian and much more equitably based than we ever have been. At least on laws. I mean, there's no. I'm a champion of legal theory and the rule of law. Right now, maybe laws aren't equally applied, but if they are, the laws are written, I think, to be egalitarian in its nature. So we've come a long way, and that's good that the aspiration of all men and women are equal before the eyes of their Creator. We have a very bad history in living up to it, but that's the history where we are today. We've come a long way. And if we could just apply the laws as they are written in subjective form, I think we are going to finally come to a closer fruition to those words in the Declaration of Independence. But anyways, way off track. I'm a little excited there. And we know women were often advocating for many of these egalitarian things during the time, everything from child labor to union labor, to getting fair wages and fair working conditions, and to have African Americans treated with more equitably in the South. They themselves didn't get the right to vote until 1920, and the suffragette movement was coming, and feminist writers were becoming known during this period of time, questioning the role of what women should be predetermined to be, domesticated and things like that, and they should have their own lives and their own dreams and their own autonomy. Became a new wave, and boy, slow, very slow. There's a reluctance to move in a recognition of women's egalitarian rights, but it was taking shape not just during this period. We know back in the 1840s, I believe, they had the big suffragette movement in Seneca Falls, New York. I visited there to see the thing where they wrote their Declaration of Independence, basically, and their claim for voters' rights, and it still didn't happen until 1920. But some of these feminist movements were coming out, and they often fought within the cities to create things like settlement houses and other social agencies to help the poor, to educate the poor, and to alleviate hunger. And they were often on the leading edge of many of these movements to create a better society, but they often, for their own, at least in terms of power, in terms of political participation and voting, were often left behind. And the other one that I almost missed, I try to keep these relatively short, these reviews, but the alcohol consumption, they've been fighting. We know that alcohol has been a major problem in the history of our country, ebbing and flowing, especially with immigration. And they were big behind the temperance movement. Most people don't like the temperance movement, meaning that the banning of alcohol and the prohibition of alcohol in our country's history really backfired. But if you want to look at a group that was responsible for getting through, it was largely the women's movement that was successful in moving for the temperance movement, because alcoholism and men basically squandering their money from work and not feeding their family and taking care of their family with their money. And not only that, but alcohol overconsumption was awfully a catalyst to domestic violence and abuse. And they brought it to the head, and they're the ones that are responsible for getting it passed. Unfortunately, it's probably too much of a law, and we know it backfired. More people started drinking after Prohibition than ever before. And then we know there's this period of time, and it's going to come up definitely in the next chapter, that we were had this manifest destiny not only with our own nation, but we started believing that the Western world, the United States, was basically the beacon of hope for the entire world. And we're going to start our imperialistic view of spreading democracy and American values throughout the world because we're the greatest, we're the best, and we know it, and we're the God's chosen people. And there was a real belief in our nation's history, maybe it still is, in existence that many advocates ardently championed Western imperialism, cheering on attempts to civilize non-Western people. Gilded men, that's called the Gilded Age of great industrialism, were encouraged to embrace a particular vision of masculinity connected intimately with the rising tides of nationalism, materialism, and militarism. And that's an important aspect of it during this period of the country. Talk about some of the things that were changing here now with radio and movies started becoming significant also through Edison. And others, but he was one of the big ones. Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, some of these famous actors during this period of time, and some of the great record producers were produced during this period. A lot of stuff. History always has a lot of stuff in it. Just trying to hit the high points. Other than that, trying to have a good day. Sorry, this is brief and sometimes a bit superficial, but it's just a way to talk about some of the highlights during the industrialization of our country, because it really changed its nature significantly. It connected us as a nation. The Civil War did that as well, but in terms of the trains and the travel and the commerce, we became a nation like one as it never had been before. And I'll leave you with that thought.